On the final day of 1600 AD, Queen Elizabeth I placed the royal seal upon a document that appeared, at first glance, to belong to the ordinary world of commerce. It granted a group of English merchants the exclusive right to trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. A monopoly, privilege, a venture of ships, cargoes, credit, risk, and return. But history often conceals its most dangerous revolutions inside administrative language. The English East India Company was chartered to trade. Yet by the late 18th century AD, that same corporation possessed revenue rights over some of the richest lands in Asia and commanded a vast army of sepoys, Indian soldiers drilled, paid, and deployed in the service of a corporate power. By the early 19th century AD, it made treaties, collected taxes, enforced law, waged war, punished enemies, installed rulers, and governed millions. And still, it spoke in the language of contracts, dividends, compensation, and commercial necessity. Here lies the central paradox. A company, born to buy and sell, learned to rule. This was not empire in its oldest costume. It did not begin with a sacred dynasty, an ancestral throne, or a conquering monarch claiming the earth by divine inheritance. It began with shareholders, directors, clerks, captains, accountants, lobbyists, and adventurers operating under royal permission. It was private capital wearing public authority. It was a merchant house protected by naval power, legitimized by a crown, strengthened by parliament when useful, and armed by soldiers whose loyalty rested on pay, discipline, patronage, honor, and survival. The company became a hybrid organism, part business, part embassy, part fortress, part army, part intelligence network, part shadow state. Its power grew precisely because it lived between categories. When it failed, it could present itself as a traitor exposed to risk. When it succeeded, it could demand the rewards of sovereignty. When it fought, it called the violence defensive. When it extracted wealth, it called the process revenue. When it influenced courts, bought allies, manipulated succession, and installed rulers, it described these acts as the protection of commercial rights. A ledger became a musket became a treaty became a throne. I am Professor Adrian Lockwell, the Time Detective, and this is Archives of Humanity, where history is not treated as a procession of dates, but as a war room of human decisions. The corporate conquest of India was not simply a story of British ambition, nor was it a story of India as a passive prize waiting to be seized. India was wealthy, politically complex, commercially sophisticated, and filled with rulers, bankers, soldiers, brokers, informants, courtiers, and rival powers making rational calculations under pressure. The company did not rise because history had chosen it in advance. It rose because incentives aligned in dangerous ways. Profit sought security. Security demanded armed force. Armed force required revenue. Revenue created political leverage. And political leverage, once acquired, rarely returns willingly to the marketplace from which it came. The East India Company's empire was not an accident of battlefield luck. It was the result of ambiguity. Legal ambiguity, moral ambiguity, political ambiguity. It grew because a state outsourced danger to merchants. Because merchants discovered that trade became safer when protected by cannon. Because Indian political factions sometimes saw foreign companies as useful instruments in their own struggles. And because accountability, as so often in history, arrived only after power had already hardened into fact. The question, then, is not merely how Britain conquered India. That question is too blunt. The sharper question is this: how did an institution designed for profit acquire the powers of government while avoiding, for as long as possible, the full moral burden of governing human beings? To answer that, the chessboard must first be revealed. Before the company could become imperial, it had to enter a world already rich, sophisticated, and fiercely contested. A world where Asia was wealthy, Europe was hungry, and the ocean itself had become a weapon of strategy. The corporation's rise begins not with British strength, but with European dependence. The map must widen beyond London boardrooms and Bengal battlefields, because the first fact is fatal to later imperial mythology. Europe did not enter the Indian Ocean as master. It entered as a hungry frontier of the world economy, chasing goods it could not produce with the same quality, scale, or prestige. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries AD, Asian trade was not a decorative luxury at the edge of history. It was one of the great engines of global power. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, silk, cotton textiles, saltpeter for gunpowder, and later tea were not merely items on a merchant's list. They shaped diets, fashions, armies, courtly status, and state finance. Whoever controlled access to Asia did not simply become rich. That power could redirect silver, credit, naval ambition, and political influence across continents. The Portuguese had already exposed the first brutal lesson. Their Estado de India, built across the 16th century AD, proved that cannon-armed ships could seize choke points, intimidate ports, tax sea lanes, and construct fortified enclaves. But influence was not dominion. The Portuguese could wound the oceanic system. They could not simply possess the civilizations surrounding it. The Indian Ocean was not empty water waiting for European arrival. It was a dense commercial world of Arab, Gujarati, Malay, Persian, Armenian, Tamil, and Chinese merchants, governed by customs houses, credit networks, diplomatic rituals, and rulers who understood force perfectly well. Europe arrived with artillery. It did not arrive with inevitability. Then came the Dutch. In 1602 AD, the Dutch VOC was chartered, and it made the next institutional leap: corporate war at scale. The VOC fused shareholders, monopoly privilege, permanent capital, fortified bases, fleets, diplomacy, and coercion into a machine built for armed commerce. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600 AD, entered a world where its rivals were already teaching the same lesson. Trade routes could become battle lines, and a balance sheet could become a strategic weapon. And then there was India. The prize, yes, but never a passive prize. In the company's early decades, the Mughal Empire stood among the wealthiest and most administratively sophisticated powers on earth. Under Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, Mughal authority rested on revenue systems, elite negotiation, military capacity, Persianate court culture, and a vast agrarian base. This was a political civilization of governors, mansabdars, bankers, scribes, brokers, and merchants. A foreign trader did not begin by commanding. It began by requesting permission. Sir Thomas Roe's embassy to Jahangir from 1615 AD to 1619 AD revealed the real posture of the early English company. It was not a conqueror demanding tribute. It was a petitioner seeking privileges inside a superior political order. The Mughal court did not see England as destiny. It saw another distant maritime people asking for the right to buy and sell. The deeper magnet was cloth. Indian cottons and calicos, especially from Bengal, Gujarat, and the Coromandel coast, were among the most desired manufactured goods in the world. These regions were not raw material backwaters. They were advanced production zones whose textiles drew global demand and global silver. Europe wanted what India made. India did not need English goods in equal measure. That imbalance created the company's central strategic humiliation. Trade required bullion. Silver had to flow east to purchase the goods European markets craved. And inside that imbalance lay the temptation that would one day become empire. So long as the company merely bought Indian goods, it depended on silver, permission, and local authority. But if Indian taxes could pay for Indian textiles, Indian soldiers, and Indian wars, the equation would be transformed. Trade would no longer drain bullion. Territory would finance trade. Revenue would finance armies. Armies would secure more revenue. In 1600 AD, that logic was still embryonic. But the seed was already present beneath invoices, petitions, and commercial diplomacy. The global economy supplied the hunger. Asian wealth supplied the attraction. European rivalry supplied the pressure. What remained was the instrument, a royal charter that could turn merchants into a legal weapon. The motive came from the global economy. The mechanism came from law. The decisive instrument, at first, was not a cannon, a regiment, or a fortress. It was a document. On December 31st, 1600 AD, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. Its language seemed administrative, almost harmless. Governors, merchants, privileges, voyages, terms of trade. Yet inside that formal vocabulary stood one of the most consequential inventions of the early modern world: a private corporation armed with public privilege. The charter granted the company a monopoly over English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. That phrase contained an enormous strategic horizon. It did not merely describe a trade route. It marked a zone of ambition stretching across the Indian Ocean, into Asian markets, ports, courts, and fiscal systems that England wanted to enter but could not yet command. Here, the grand chessboard became constitutional. England lacked the money, ships, bureaucracy, and experience to dominate Asian commerce through direct royal administration. The Portuguese had arrived earlier. The Dutch VOC, chartered in 1602 AD, was already demonstrating that commerce could be organized like war, disciplined, financed, protected, and weaponized. Spain and Portugal had built empires through crown and cross. The Dutch and English moved toward a subtler formula: empire through capital, contract, monopoly, and corporate personality. The East India Company was therefore not merely a gathering of merchants. It was a political organism in commercial clothing. It could raise money from investors. It could organize voyages too expensive for individual traders. It could own property, sue and be sued, make internal rules, negotiate abroad, build fortified factories, and use violence when that violence could be described as defense. It could lobby parliament at home while bargaining with rulers overseas. This was the genius and the danger of the chartered company. Responsibility was divided into compartments. Shareholders wanted returns. The court of directors managed policy, strategy, and risk from London. The court of proprietors represented the broader body of investors, pressing for dividends and influence. Captains and factors on distant coasts improvised under pressure, often with incomplete orders and immense temptation. The crown gained a strategic instrument against Iberian, Dutch, and later French rivals without paying the full cost of empire from the royal treasury. No single hand seemed to hold the whole blade. That was precisely what made the blade so useful. Monopoly in this world was not simply an economic privilege. It was national strategy outsourced to private ambition. The crown could claim it was encouraging trade. Investors could claim they were pursuing commerce. Company servants could claim they were protecting property. Each statement carried a fragment of truth. Yet fused together, those fragments produced a form of power that was difficult to name, and therefore difficult to restrain. The company's first empire was not territory. It was legal ambiguity. That ambiguity mattered because sovereignty rarely announces its birth. More often, it arrives disguised as necessity. A warehouse requires guards. Guards require walls. Walls require authority. Authority demands negotiation. Negotiation creates leverage. And leverage, once discovered, begins to look less like an emergency measure and more like a business model. The charter created a loophole in the moral architecture of the state. England could project force and pursue wealth while keeping responsibility at a distance. If a voyage failed, private investors absorbed much of the loss. If a voyage succeeded, the nation gained treasure, prestige, and strategic reach. Risk could be privatized when convenient. Advantage could be nationalized when useful. This did not make conquest inevitable. Paperwork alone does not build an empire. But paperwork can build the chamber in which later decisions ignite. A monopoly teaches its holders to think in exclusive rights. A charter teaches merchants to speak in the voice of law. Royal sanction gives private appetite a public shadow. Over time, the company would learn that defending commerce and commanding politics could be made to sound like the same act. And so the merchants sailed east not as kings, but not as ordinary traders either. They carried ledgers, letters, cannon, and a peculiar confidence born from English law. The belief that a corporation could borrow the authority of a nation without yet bearing the burdens of a state. Now that legal weapon had to survive contact with reality. In Asian waters, profit would depend on permission. Permission would depend on diplomacy. And diplomacy, under pressure, would soon become inseparable from convoy, fortification, and force. A royal charter could give English merchants a legal identity, a monopoly, and the confidence to speak in the language of national destiny. But it could not open a single Indian harbor by force of parchment alone. In Mughal India, access was not conquered at the beginning. It was requested, negotiated, purchased, renewed, and sometimes threatened with withdrawal. The company's first education in India was therefore not an education in mastery. It was an education in dependence. The word factory hides this reality. These were not industrial plants. They were commercial stations, warehouses, counting houses, residences, courts of arbitration, guarded compounds, and listening posts embedded in older systems of authority. Every bale of cloth and every chest of silver moved through a dense world of imperial farmans, local privileges, customs officials, brokers, interpreters, financiers, and court politics. The company was not yet the ruler of this world. It was an ambitious guest, tolerated because it was useful, watched because it was foreign, and restrained because its legal footing remained fragile. Surat became the first great lesson. On India's western coast, after English naval successes against the Portuguese in the early 17th century AD, the company gained a stronger position inside the Mughal port system. Yet even there, victory at sea did not translate into sovereignty on land. English ships could challenge Portuguese power in the Arabian Sea, but ashore they still depended on Mughal permission and local calculation. This was the paradox of early company power. Cannon could win attention, but only politics could secure trade. Then came the coastal anchors that later generations would mistake for the inevitable skeleton of empire. Madras and Fort St. George developed from 1640 AD on the Coromandel coast, where local agreement gave the company a foothold and walls gave that foothold a new meaning. Bombay entered English hands through dynastic marriage, as part of the Portuguese dowry of Catherine of Braganza to Charles II in 1661 AD. In 1668 AD, the crown leased Bombay to the company, converting a royal possession into a corporate base. In the east, Calcutta emerged after Job Charnock's activities in the 1690s, and Fort William would become the company's crucial stronghold in Bengal. Each settlement began as a commercial foothold, but each contained a political mutation. A warehouse with guards became a protected jurisdiction. A protected jurisdiction became a bargaining chip. A bargaining chip became the beginning of territorial imagination. The company learned, slowly and experimentally, that a fortified warehouse could become a political fact. Not sovereignty yet, but a rehearsal for sovereignty. Still, the grand chessboard belonged to others. Company servants sometimes confused fortified enclaves with real power, and the Mughal Empire punished that illusion. In the late 17th century AD, under the aggressive policies associated with Sir Josiah Child, the company drifted into open confrontation with Mughal authority. Child's War, from 1686 AD to 1690 AD, became a brutal correction. The company attempted pressure, seizure, and defiance. The Mughal response exposed the truth. A merchant corporation, however bold at sea, could not yet challenge the imperial center of India and expect victory. The company was forced to submit, apologize, and pay for the restoration of its privileges. That humiliation matters. Proves that empire was not born inevitable. It was born after failure, adaptation, and a careful study of weakness, first the company's own, and later the weaknesses of others. For the moment, survival required bending. The company learned to flatter courts, cultivate brokers, fortify quietly, and treat permission not as a formality, but as the foundation of existence. Then, in 1707 AD, Aurangzeb died. The Mughal center did not vanish overnight, but the architecture of authority began to loosen. The age of singular permission was giving way to an age of competing permissions, and in that dangerous pluralism, the company would find its opening. After 1707 AD, the old imperial grammar changed. Aurangzeb died after a reign of immense ambition and immense strain. For decades, the Mughal state had poured men, money, cavalry, and administrative attention into long wars, especially in the Deccan. The empire he left behind did not simply collapse like a broken wall. It still possessed majesty, ritual authority, legal memory, and the prestige of a name that could make local power appear legitimate. But its center no longer commanded the same gravitational force. Orders from Delhi still mattered. They no longer settled everything. This is where the story is often flattened into a convenient myth. The Mughals declined, and Europeans stepped into an empty space. The reality was sharper. India did not become empty. It became intensely competitive. Across the subcontinent, authority decentralized into successor states and regional powers with their own ambitions, armies, treasuries, and political intelligence. Bengal, under its Nawabs, became a wealthy semi-autonomous powerhouse, tied to textiles, grain, saltpeter, river trade, and banking networks of extraordinary sophistication. Hyderabad emerged from the imperial world of the Deccan. Awadh rose in the Gangetic Plain, rich, strategic, and indispensable. The Marathas expanded with remarkable political energy, challenging older imperial geographies through tribute, mobility, and confederate power. Mysore, further south, would become a laboratory of military innovation and state-building. Around them moved Rajput houses, Sikh power in the northwest, zamindars, bankers, mercenary commanders, religious authorities, scribes, brokers, and court factions. This was not chaos in the childish sense. It was a brutal marketplace of calculation. Every ruler faced the same fiscal military equation. Authority required revenue. Revenue required enforcement. Enforcement required soldiers, artillery, horses, gunpowder, forts, officers, and credit. Legitimacy still mattered. A Mughal title, a court genealogy, a religious sanction, a treaty, a marriage alliance. But legitimacy without money became theater. Money without armed force became an invitation to predation. Armed force without credit became temporary violence. Into this world, European companies discovered a new usefulness. They were no longer merely petitioners begging for customs privileges at coastal factories. They could supply cannon. They could drill infantry. They could lend naval support. They could move bullion, extend credit, carry intelligence, and connect local disputes to global flows of capital and war. They could provide armed men whose loyalties were not tied to the same kinship networks, court factions, and hereditary obligations as domestic rivals. The English company's opportunity came from an almost perfect ambiguity. It was small enough to be invited into disputes, not yet so vast that every ruler saw it as the central danger. It did not arrive as a declared empire under one unmistakable royal banner. It appeared as a useful instrument. Merchants with forts, ships, cash, clerks, and disciplined troops. Yet it was armed enough to alter outcomes inside a succession struggle, a revenue quarrel, or a court conspiracy. That combination was lethal. Too modest to unite all enemies against it, too powerful to remain a mere servant. Here lies one of the oldest patterns in political history. Elites under pressure often invite the outsider to defeat the rival within. The calculation can feel perfectly rational. A banker wants stability. A minister wants survival. A claimant wants a throne. A governor wants artillery. A court faction wants leverage. The outsider is imagined as temporary, a hired blade, a foreign weight placed on the scales and removed once the local contest is settled. But power rarely leaves simply because the invitation has expired. The company learned to enter through openings that Indian actors themselves understood, negotiated, and used. This was not a tale of passive collapse. It was an auction house for armed alliances, where every bargain made sense locally, yet together began to rewire the politics of the subcontinent. And just as Indian succession struggles became more open to outside military assistance, Europe carried its own rivalries eastward. The next lesson would be harsher still. When French and British competition fused with Indian political conflict, the trading company would discover that empire could be tested, refined, and prototyped on the battlefield. Regional fragmentation created the opening. European rivalry supplied the pressure. By the 1740s AD, the wars of Europe had become too large to remain confined to Europe. The War of the Austrian Succession was fought over dynasties, alliances, and the balance of power, but its consequences moved along the sea lanes into Asia. A conflict born in European courts reached Indian harbors, fortified settlements, and commercial enclaves. The old boundary between merchant and soldier began to dissolve. A trading factory was no longer only a warehouse. It could become a cannon platform, a treasury, an embassy, and a recruiting station. South India became the laboratory. The Carnatic Wars, stretching from the 1740s into the 1760s AD, were not merely European battles displaced onto Indian soil. That interpretation is too narrow, because Indian politics was not passive scenery. These wars fused several contests at once. British and French companies seeking commercial and strategic advantage, Indian claimants competing for succession, Nawabs and regional powers calculating survival, bankers measuring credit and risk, and military entrepreneurs discovering that disciplined troops could decide arguments that legitimacy alone could not settle. The French moved first with dangerous imagination. Joseph-François Dupleix, governor of the French Company des Inns at Pondicherry, understood something that more cautious merchants still resisted. A European company did not need to conquer vast territory in order to shape power. It could intervene in a succession crisis, support a claimant, supply trained infantry and artillery, and receive influence as repayment. A ruler might remain sovereign in title, but if his throne depended on company battalions, his independence had already been mortgaged. Dupleix's insight was not that Indian states were weak. It was subtler and more consequential. Fragmented sovereignty creates markets for force. Where legitimacy, revenue, and military security were contested, a compact, disciplined army could tilt a struggle far larger than its size. The prototype of proxy empire appeared here. Not annexation first, but arbitration by gunpowder. The English company learned by imitation and emergency. French success forced English merchants to become military politicians. They learned that influence required more than ships, contracts, and royal charters. It required allies inside courts, advances from creditors, intelligence from brokers and translators, and troops capable of holding formation when political calculation became battlefield pressure. And at the center of this transformation stood the sepoy, not as background, not as ornament, as foundation. Indian soldiers trained in European drill made corporate warfare scalable. Without sepoys, the European companies remained thin, coastal, and vulnerable. With sepoys, they acquired depth, endurance, and reach. These soldiers served for pay, status, patronage, discipline, local obligation, and professional identity. Their tactical adaptation made possible the strange architecture of company power. Indian manpower, European command, commercial finance, and political objectives presented as security. Then Arcot, in 1751 AD, gave the lesson dramatic form. Robert Clive's seizure and defense of Arcot during the Carnatic struggle became a psychological event as much as a military one. The numbers were modest. The resources were limited. Yet audacity, when attached to a recognized claimant and supported by disciplined troops, could create political shock out of proportion to its scale. Arcot mattered because it revealed that perception itself could be weaponized. A small force that appeared resolute could shake confidence in larger coalitions. A daring move could make allies hesitate, enemies doubt, financiers recalculate, and wavering elites ask the oldest question in politics: who is likely to win? War finance completed the formula. Campaigns did not move on courage alone. They moved on credit, compensation agreements, revenue promises, and the confidence of banking networks. Military power and financial trust fed one another. A company that could promise future revenue could borrow for present war. A company that won present war could secure future revenue. The loop was not yet perfected, but its outline had appeared. The Carnatic was therefore more than a regional conflict. It was the place where corporations learned the grammar of proxy empire. Duplex experimented. The English adapted. Indian rulers maneuvered. Sepoys made the system possible. Bankers priced the risks. And from this collision came a discovery that would soon become catastrophic. A corporation did not need to be the largest power in India to become decisive. It only needed to stand at the pressure point where succession, money, and disciplined violence met. The experiment began in the south. Its most profitable application would move east, toward Bengal, a province so rich that control over it would transform armed trade into something far more dangerous. The experiment in the Carnatic revealed a dangerous formula. Disciplined troops, local alliances, credit, and political timing could allow a European company to punch far above its weight. But the formula needed a larger treasury. It found one in Bengal. By the mid-18th century AD, Bengal was among the richest regions in the world. This was not wealth in the abstract. It was wealth with machinery behind it. Fertile agriculture, dense river commerce, silk production, cotton textiles, skilled weavers, powerful merchants, and banking houses capable of financing rulers, wars, and succession struggles. Bengal converted harvests into revenue, textiles into silver, and credit into political power. For a company learning to transform trade into dominion, Bengal was not merely a province. It was a fiscal engine. The English East India Company understood this with growing clarity. Its public language remained careful and legalistic. Company officials spoke of lawful commerce, inherited privileges, security for their settlements, and rights granted under earlier Mughal authority. But beneath that polished vocabulary lay a more disruptive reality. Company servants often used commercial privileges for private gain. Passes, exemptions, and immunities that had been designed to protect company trade became tools for personal enrichment and revenue evasion. To Bengal's officials, this did not look like free commerce. It looked like a leak in the state itself. Here the conflict moved beyond personality. The company wanted autonomy without local accountability. The Nawabi government wanted revenue without corporate evasion. Each side believed the other was attacking the proper order of authority. The company described Bengal's restrictions as arbitrary interference. Bengal's officers saw the company as a fortified commercial minority behaving like a state within the state. Suspicion was not a mood. It was a political structure. In 1756 AD, Siraj-ud-Daulah became Nawab of Bengal. He was young, forceful, and deeply suspicious, but caricature explains less than strategy. British accounts later portrayed him as irrational and cruel, yet Siraj inherited a court already divided by ambition and fear. Around him stood commanders calculating advantage, great banking interests uneasy with uncertainty, aristocratic rivals, relatives with claims and grievances, and European companies whose wars elsewhere threatened to spill into Bengal. His authority was real, but it was not secure. An insecure authority tends to treat ambiguity as danger. Calcutta became the point where these pressures hardened. The company had strengthened Fort William, partly in response to the possibility of renewed Anglo-French conflict. To Siraj, however, fortification inside his territory was not a neutral defensive measure. It was a claim. A foreign corporation was expanding military protection, sheltering people he considered political offenders, and stretching commercial privileges past the limits of sovereignty. Fortification was politics in brick and cannon. It announced that the company intended to negotiate from behind walls. Siraj moved against Calcutta in 1756 AD, and the settlement fell. In British memory, this event became inseparable from the so-called Black Hole of Calcutta, the reported imprisonment and death of British captives in a confined space. The episode must be handled carefully. The suffering of captives became real political force, but the scale, details, and later retellings have long been contested by historians. Its significance lies not only in what happened, but in what the story was made to do. The black hole became moral ammunition, a narrative of outrage used to justify retaliation, intervention, and a widening claim to power. Empires often discover that memory, once disciplined into propaganda, can move armies. Yet the fall of Calcutta did not create the crisis from nothing. It exposed forces already converging: Bengal's immense revenue, the company's appetite for protected privilege, Siraj's fragile position, and a courtly world where bankers, generals, and courtiers were already measuring the cost of loyalty. This was no longer a quarrel over warehouses or customs duties. It was a struggle over who would command the resources capable of financing the next stage of conquest. Into this charged atmosphere stepped the hidden architects of history. Financiers with ledgers more decisive than swords, courtiers trading loyalty for survival, company agents fluent in pressure and deception, and a young Nawab increasingly surrounded by distrust. The road to Plassey would not be paved by battlefield courage alone. It would be built in promises, calculations, and whispers. By early 1757 AD, Bengal had become a political chamber of mirrors. Every faction watched every other faction. Every promise seemed to contain a hidden bargain. Robert Clive and the East India Company had retaken Calcutta, but revenge alone cannot explain what followed. The company had learned something more dangerous than vengeance. A fort could be lost and recovered. A treaty could be signed and violated. But if Bengal's internal politics could be mastered, insecurity could be converted into dominion. Siraj-ud-Daulah, the young Nawab of Bengal, stood at the center of this unstable court. He was not facing only foreign merchants with guns. He was facing aristocrats who doubted his judgment, military commanders who resented his authority, merchants frightened by disorder, and financial houses whose survival depended on predictable power. Among the most influential were the Jugat Seth banking interests, whose reach moved through credit, court access, and quiet calculation. Historical caution matters here. Conspiracy was not a single room where every participant shared one motive. It was a climate of fear, profit, ambition, and mistrust, until the right pressure point appeared. That pressure point was Mir Jafar, a senior commander in the Nawab's army and a man of rank, grievance, and opportunity. To Clive, Mir Jafar was more than a useful ally. He was the hinge on which Bengal might be turned without a full conquest. The company did not need to defeat Bengal in the old heroic style if Bengal's own elite machinery could be persuaded to replace its ruler. This was the strategic mutation at the heart of Plassey: war as corporate regime change. Then came the episode that reveals the moral temperature of the operation. Amakand, a wealthy intermediary involved in the negotiations, became entangled in the secret bargain. When he allegedly demanded a vast payment to keep the conspiracy hidden, Clive and his associates used deception. 2 treaty versions, one genuine, one false. The forged treaty controversy would shadow Clive's reputation because it exposed the company's emerging ethic with brutal clarity. In this world, legality could be staged, signatures could become theater, and truth could be treated as a negotiable instrument. On June 23, 1757 AD, at Plassey, Siraj-ud-Daulah's army was numerically superior. The company force was smaller, built around European troops, artillery, and Indian sepoys. On paper, the Nawab possessed the weight of the field. But numbers are not power when command has been hollowed out from within. Key commanders hesitated. Mir Jafar did not commit decisively. Loyalty, the invisible architecture of every army, had already been undermined before the decisive exchanges began. Plassey was therefore not merely a battlefield. It was an intelligence operation with artillery smoke. It was a financial calculation wearing a military uniform. The fighting mattered. Men died, guns fired, and decisions under pressure shaped the day. But the deeper outcome had been prepared through whispers, guarantees, letters, and promises. Plassey was less a battle won by courage than a regime change purchased with promises. Siraj fled, was captured, and was killed soon after. Mir Jafar was installed as Nawab, but the throne had changed its nature. It still possessed ceremony, titles, and the outward language of sovereignty. Behind it now stood a company that could decide who ruled, what payments were due, and how obedience would be enforced. The merchant had become kingmaker. The spoils were immediate and astonishing. Company servants received fortunes. Robert Clive became one of the richest and most controversial men in Britain. These were not harmless private windfalls crossing the sea. Bengal's wealth entered British politics, bought estates, shaped parliamentary careers, and turned the word nabob into a symbol of imperial money, returning home with the odor of scandal. Yet Plassey did not create stable sovereignty. It created a puppet arrangement swollen with expectations, debts, resentment, and impossible demands. The company had discovered that controlling a ruler was not the same as controlling a revenue system. Once that distinction became clear, Bengal moved toward the next collision: Buxar, where the question would no longer be who stood behind the throne, but who possessed sovereignty itself. Plassey solved one problem for the company and created a greater one. It removed Siraj-ud-Daulah, but it did not settle the deeper question of power in Bengal. Who would command the treasury? Mir Jafar sat on the Nawab's throne, yet that throne had been mortgaged before he reached it. His elevation carried a crushing price: compensation for Calcutta, rewards for company officers, payments to troops, gifts to allies, and promises made in the private negotiations where Plassey had truly been decided. A regime born from conspiracy now had to pay the bills of conspiracy. Bengal was wealthy, But no treasury is infinite when every faction treats it as spoils. Here the drama changes character. Plassey was a coup. The road to Buxar was a structural crisis. The company did not merely want influence at court. It wanted commercial privilege without fiscal restraint. Its servants used trade exemptions, passes, and private networks to move goods while avoiding duties that Bengal's own merchants were still expected to pay. The company spoke the language of rights, security, and treaty obligation. But beneath that language, a more corrosive mechanism was forming. Private profit was eating into public revenue. This was the heart of fiscal sovereignty. A ruler who cannot control taxation is not fully sovereign. A state that cannot decide who pays duties, who receives exemptions, and who trades under protected status is being hollowed from within. The Nawab might still hold court, issue orders, and receive ceremonial obedience. But if a foreign corporation and its employees could stand outside the revenue system, then sovereignty had become negotiable. Mir Jafar could not stabilize this impossible arrangement. He had been useful to the company, then increasingly inconvenient to it. In 1760 AD, company influence helped replace him with Mir Qasim, who seemed better suited to restore order. But Mir Qasim was not a decorative puppet. He understood that Bengal could not survive as a treasury with a throne attached. He moved his capital to Mughal, sought to strengthen administration, reorganize finances, discipline the army, and reduce dependence on company favor. These were not reckless gestures. They were rational attempts to recover the basic grammar of rule. His most revealing move was fiscal. If company servants claimed privileged trade and escaped internal duties, Mir Qasim answered with a devastatingly logical reform. He abolished internal duties for everyone. Bengal's merchants would no longer be forced to compete against company-backed private traders who enjoyed special protection. It was a fiscal equalizer. And precisely because it was rational, it was intolerable. For the company, equality at the customs barrier meant the loss of advantage. Its servants had grown accustomed not merely to trade, but to privileged trade. Not merely to treaty rights, but to commercial immunity. Conflict became nearly inevitable, because the company wanted the benefits of sovereignty while refusing subordination to Bengal's fiscal authority. Mir Qasim's break with the company widened into war. Driven from Bengal, he looked for allies strong enough to contain the corporate advance before it became irreversible. He joined Shuja-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Awadh, a major regional ruler with his own reasons to fear company expansion. With them stood Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor, whose political power had weakened, but whose name still carried the weight of imperial legitimacy. This coalition was not a mindless reaction. It was a late but coherent attempt to draw a boundary around the company's rise. Bengal, Awadh, and the Mughal court had different interests, but they shared one strategic fear. If the company could dictate revenue in Bengal, then every neighboring sovereignty was exposed. The issue was no longer one Nawab, one treaty, one insult, or one disputed privilege. The issue was whether an armed corporation could become the arbiter of Indian fiscal power. By 1764 AD, the hidden rule created after Plassey had reached its limit. Intrigue had opened the gate, but intrigue alone could not hold the province. The company now had to prove something far more consequential. Not whether it could manage betrayal inside a court, but whether it could defeat an Indian coalition in open war. That test would come at Buxar. The coalition that advanced toward Buxar was not another palace conspiracy dressed in military colors. It was a late attempt to build a wall around the company before corporate power hardened into political permanence. Mir Qasim, driven from Bengal after trying to restore the fiscal authority of the Nawab, Shuja-ud-Dowlah, the powerful Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor whose name still carried the fading prestige of imperial legitimacy, converged around one strategic purpose: containment. On October 22, 1764 AD, near Buxar, that containment failed. The company army was commanded by Hector Munro. It was not a vast imperial host in the old Mughal style. It was something newer, colder, and in many ways more dangerous. A disciplined corporate army, financed by commerce, organized through European command structures, and made powerful by Indian sepoy manpower. Against it stood a coalition with numbers, rank, territory, and symbolic authority. But battle does not reward symbolism alone. It rewards cohesion. It rewards command. It rewards the ability to turn many interests into one will. The coalition possessed weight, but the company possessed integration. This is why Buxar mattered differently from Plassey. Plassey had shown how finance, betrayal, and court politics could break a regime from within. Buxar showed something more decisive. The company could defeat a major Indian coalition in open battle. It was no longer merely the spider inside a palace web. It had become a field power, And in the anatomy of empire, that distinction is everything. A factional coup can be reversed. Puppet Nawab can rebel. A settlement imposed through intrigue can collapse under the pressure of new alliances. But when a corporate army defeats the forces assembled to restrain it, the political imagination of a region changes. Bankers recalculate risk. Rulers reconsider resistance. Allies become cautious. Enemies begin to wonder whether defiance is strategy or bankruptcy. Buxar did not simply defeat an army. It weakened the assumption that the company could still be treated as a troublesome merchant among princes. Then came the act that turned victory into structure, the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765 AD. Under that settlement, Shah Alam II granted the company the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The word sounds administrative, almost harmless. But Diwani meant revenue collection authority. It meant access to the tax base of one of the richest regions in the world. It meant the company no longer depended only on trade profits, loans, compensation payments, or gifts extracted from anxious rulers. It could now draw directly from land revenue, commercial activity, villages, harvests, and the administrative machinery of eastern India. Here, the hidden engine of empire began to turn. Taxation paid for troops. Troops secured taxation. Taxation funded expansion. Revenue became military capacity. Military capacity became political leverage. Political leverage produced more revenue. That was the loop. That was the revelation. Not conquest as an event, but conquest as a self-financing machine. The danger of the arrangement lay in its legality. The company did not simply declare itself king. It received authority under the fading seal of the Mughal emperor. The old imperial language remained, but the substance of power had moved. The throne supplied legitimacy. The company collected the money. The appearance was continuity. The reality was transfer. This is how sovereignty often changes hands in history, not only through shattered crowns and burning capitals, but through signatures, seals, contracts, and account books. The company could still speak the language of commerce. Directors in London could still discuss dividends, investments, and trade. Servants in India could still pretend that rule was an accident attached to business. But after the Diwani, the mask was dangerously thin. A merchant that commands armies is alarming. A merchant that collects taxes is something else entirely. It is a state in all but honesty. From this point forward, the company's central problem was no longer survival in India. It was governance without confession, how to rule what it had acquired while still pretending to be primarily a commercial institution. And across the distance between Bengal's taxpayers and London's shareholders, a new moral geography opened. Consequence in one world, profit in another. The grant of Diwani did not merely give the company a new income stream. It placed millions of lives inside an accounting experiment that no merchant board was morally prepared to conduct. Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa became the fiscal bloodstream of a corporate empire. But the men who now profited from that bloodstream had not been formed as guardians of agrarian society. They were traders, factors, soldiers, speculators, and political opportunists, trained by a world of contracts, commissions, monopolies, and private fortunes. The result was not orderly government. It was sovereignty without a mature conscience. In theory, the Mughal emperor had granted revenue rights while existing Indian administrative structures continued to operate. In practice, authority became deliberately fogged. The company could claim the profits of rule while shifting responsibility for the burdens of rule. Power moved between Calcutta, Murshidabad, London, and the countryside like a shadow that no institution wished to own completely. Out of this blurred empire emerged a new and disturbing figure in British life, the Nabob. Company servants returned from India with fortunes that seemed almost magical to observers at home. They purchased estates, entered elite society, influenced parliamentary seats, and unsettled older aristocratic hierarchies. Their wealth did not come from ancestral land alone, nor from ordinary commerce. It came from a distant political order that most Britons barely understood. Bengal's revenue was being converted into British status, British property, and British political leverage. This was why the Nabob mattered. He revealed that conquest abroad could corrupt the constitution at home. Empire was not safely beyond the horizon. It was entering Westminster, buying country houses, and reshaping elections. In Bengal itself, the machinery of rule began to grind. Revenue demands remained severe. Private trade expanded. Company servants and their allies exploited privileges that disrupted markets and weakened established fiscal arrangements. Corruption was not simply the vice of a few greedy men. It was structural. The institution rewarded extraction, tolerated ambiguity, and measured success through remittances, dividends, military solvency, and the ability to satisfy investors far from the consequences. Then came the Bengal famine of 1770 AD. The catastrophe killed millions. Historians continue to debate the full balance of causes. Drought, crop failure, market disruption, regional vulnerability, and the limited capacity of 18th century administration all mattered. But complexity is not absolution. Company revenue policies, rigid collection, administrative disorder, and failures of relief deepened the moral disaster. A ruling power may not command the rain, but it is judged by how it governs when the harvest fails. Here, the cold distance of company rule becomes its most devastating feature. A shortfall could become a column in a ledger. A village could become an assessment. Hunger could be treated as a fiscal inconvenience until its scale became politically impossible to ignore. The famine exposed the central horror of the company's new order. Profit and coercion had fused, while accountability remained delayed, diluted, and deniable. And yet, the company itself soon faced financial crisis. This was the great contradiction. It possessed revenue rights, territory, and armies, yet still lurched toward insolvency. Extraction did not produce competence. Dominion did not create discipline. A corporation could win a province and still fail to govern the consequences of victory. British politics could no longer pretend that the East India Company was merely a commercial body operating at the edge of empire. The question became constitutional and moral at once. Could a company answerable to shareholders and directors govern millions of people? Could sovereignty be subcontracted? Had Britain allowed private appetite to wear the mask of public power? The first major answer came with the Regulating Act of 1773 AD. Parliament began imposing oversight, and the office of Governor-General of Bengal was created. Warren Hastings became the first to hold that position. Brilliant, experienced, forceful, and profoundly controversial. His task was not only to administer Bengal, but to make company power appear governable. Yet accountability did not end with reform. Followed Hastings home. In 1788 AD, his impeachment proceedings opened in Britain, becoming one of the great theaters of imperial judgment. Edmund Burke and others turned the trial into a moral drama about corruption, authority, and the rights of distant peoples under British power. Parliament had discovered that the company could not be left alone. But the next stage would reveal the deeper danger. Regulation would not dismantle the empire. It would make the empire more usable. Scandal had forced the imperial question out of counting houses and into Parliament. The company could no longer be described as a distant merchant guild that merely bought cloth, shipped tea, and defended a few warehouses. Bengal had exposed the deeper reality. A corporation chartered for trade was governing millions, collecting revenue, commanding armies, influencing courts, and shaping the fate of provinces larger and richer than many European kingdoms. Yet Britain's answer was not abolition. It was control without surrender. It placed a bridle on the creature because the creature had become useful. The Regulating Act of 1773 AD was the first serious attempt to govern the problem Britain had helped create. It elevated the Governor of Bengal into the Governor-General of Bengal, assisted by a council. It sought to impose a measure of authority over Madras and Bombay. It created a Supreme Court at Calcutta, suggesting that law, procedure, and metropolitan scrutiny would now cross the ocean with imperial power. On paper, this looked like accountability arriving at last. Parliament declaring that the rule of millions could not be left entirely to shareholders, adventurers, and men enriched by distance. But the act carried hesitation in its bones. It did not clearly define where company authority ended and crown authority began. It did not solve the contradiction between commercial profit and public duty. It did not turn the company into an ordinary arm of the British state. Instead, it produced a constitutional fog, and fog had always been one of the company's natural habitats. In that ambiguity, responsibility could be shifted, blame could be diluted, and power could continue moving. Here lay the British dilemma. In speeches, company corruption could be denounced with moral thunder. In policy, its conquests could not be casually abandoned. Bengal's revenues mattered. The company's armies mattered. Its position in Asia mattered in the rivalry with France, in the balance of global trade, and in Britain's expanding imagination of itself as an imperial power. Parliament was not a single conscience awakening in righteous horror. It was a battlefield of interests. Reformers alarmed by private despotism, investors defending dividends, ministers calculating strategy, and political patrons tied, quietly or openly, to fortunes made in India. Pitt's India Act of 1784 AD offered a more sophisticated solution to the same uncomfortable truth. It created the Board of Control, giving the British government stronger supervision over the company's political and military affairs, while leaving the Court of Directors in place to manage commerce and much of administration. This was not dismantlement. It was harnessing. The state placed its hand on the reins, but it did not shoot the horse. The result was a dual system, half corporation, half empire, private in origin, increasingly public in effect. The company still appointed servants, maintained armies, collected revenue, negotiated with Indian powers, and governed territory. Yet its decisions were now shadowed by ministers in London. A private corporation had become an instrument of national strategy, and the British Constitution stretched itself around the anomaly instead of destroying it. This is one of history's colder patterns. Accountability often arrives after power has become too profitable, too prestigious, or too strategically valuable to abolish. Exceptions become dependencies. Dependencies become systems. And once a system feeds money, security, patronage, and geopolitical ambition, outrage rarely kills it. More often, outrage reorganizes it. So Parliament discovered the monster, but also discovered that the monster served British power. Regulation did not end company empire. It made that empire more legible, more disciplined, and ultimately more durable. With oversight partially imposed, expansion could proceed not merely through opportunism, but through policy. The next age would belong to governors general who understood that sovereignty could be dismantled not only by cannon, but by treaties, debts, alliances, and the careful management of dependence. Parliament had not slain the monster. It had fitted the monster with a harness. Under the new architecture of oversight, company power became less accidental, less improvised, and in some ways more dangerous. Regulation did not end expansion. It disciplined it. The old age of plunder, scandal, and private fortunes began to harden into a repeatable imperial method. From Bengal outward, the company learned that conquest did not always require immediate annexation. It could advance through war, alliance, subsidy, debt, diplomatic isolation, and the careful architecture of treaties. This was empire as a balance sheet with bayonets standing behind the numbers. The first great warning came from Mysore. Hyder Ali, and after him Tipu Sultan, did not resemble doomed princes waiting for European instruction. They built a formidable military state in southern India, strengthened artillery, experimented with rockets, sought French support, challenged company allies, and understood that the struggle in India belonged to a wider global contest. Tipu Sultan, especially, recognized the company as something more dangerous than a normal regional rival. It was a political organism whose appetite expanded with every concession. The Mysore Wars were therefore not a regional sideshow. They were a test of whether a strong Indian military power could block company expansion before Bengal's revenues, British naval strength, and corporate military organization made resistance increasingly expensive. The answer came in 1799 AD at Seringapatam, where Tipu Sultan died defending his capital. With his fall, the company removed one of the most determined obstacles to its southern ambitions. But the deeper lesson was not merely that the company could win wars. It was that war could redesign the diplomatic map afterward. Lord Wellesley, Governor-General from 1798 AD, gave this logic its most elegant and coercive form, the subsidiary alliance. On paper, it offered security. Indian rulers who accepted it received company troops for protection. In practice, those troops had to be paid for, stationed within or near the ruler's territory, and accompanied by a surrender of independent foreign policy. No alliances without company approval. No wars without company permission. No true sovereignty without company supervision. The formula was devastatingly simple. Protection became dependency. Dependency became debt. Debt became control. For rulers facing Maratha pressure, Mysorean power, succession disputes, court faction, or the threat of British hostility itself, refusal could be perilous. Acceptance could preserve a throne. That was the strategic tragedy. These were not always acts of foolish submission. Many Indian rulers were choosing among dangers, attempting to survive inside a tightening cage. Wellesley's cold genius was to make survival itself expensive. Hyderabad entered this web. Awadh was drawn ever deeper into it. In Awadh, the company did not need immediate annexation to extract advantage. It could demand subsidies, station forces, reshape court politics, and pressure the Nawab while speaking the language of guardianship. Decades later, in 1856 AD, Awadh would be annexed outright. But the collapse of its autonomy had been managed long before the final legal blow. Then came the Maratha Confederacy. Not a simple kingdom, but a powerful constellation of houses, including the Peshwa, Scindia, Holkar, Bhosle, and Gaekwad. The Second Anglo-Maratha War, from 1803 AD to 1805 AD, broke key centers of resistance and extended company leverage across northern and central India. The Third Anglo-Maratha War, from 1817 AD to 1818 AD, completed the transformation. The Peshwa's authority was extinguished. Company dominance spread through direct rule in some places and subordinate states in others. Here was the expansion formula in its mature form. Defeat the strongest opponent, bind the survivors by treaty, make protection costly, convert debt into obedience, and preserve local rulers wherever their ceremonial authority made domination cheaper. The company did not conquer India only by marching across it. It conquered by making independent sovereignty financially unsustainable. Yet this architecture required more than governors, treaties, and accountants. It required an army of extraordinary scale, drilled, paid, and deployed across the subcontinent. And that army rested overwhelmingly on Indian soldiers, whose loyalty was real, cultivated, and indispensable, but never mechanical. The expansion of company power rested on a contradiction so vast that it almost disappears in plain sight. A British corporate empire in India was enforced, overwhelmingly, by Indian soldiers. This was the sepoy paradox. The East India Company commanded one of the largest standing military forces in Asia, but it was not an army imported from Britain across the oceans. It was, in manpower, an Indian army, recruited locally, paid from Indian revenues, disciplined through European command structures, and deployed to secure a corporate empire that spoke the language of treaty, order, and law. By the early 19th century AD, the company maintained three major presidency armies: the Bengal Army, the Madras Army, and the Bombay Army. They were not identical machines. Each had its own social geography, its own recruitment habits, and its own internal culture. The Bengal Army drew heavily from high-caste Hindu and Muslim communities in northern India, especially from regions such as Awadh and Bihar. The Madras and Bombay armies recruited more broadly across different regions, castes, and communities, shaped less by a single social profile than by local military traditions and the company's constant hunger for dependable manpower. The sepoy was never a passive instrument. He was a professional soldier making calculations inside a changing world. Service could offer regular pay, village status, pension prospects, patronage, and a place inside a powerful martial institution. For men living amid the decline of older courts, the rise of new regimes, and the insecurity of rural economies, company service could be rational, honorable, and materially necessary. But loyalty built on pay, custom, and expectation is not the same as loyalty without limits. The company understood this in its more cautious moments. It negotiated around ritual practice, caste observance, dietary rules, leave, promotion, family obligation, and the delicate politics of military honor. The sepoy drilled in European formation and carried company weapons, but his allegiance remained embedded in Indian society. He was tied to village, kinship, faith, rumor, reputation, and memory. The uniform did not erase the world from which he came. It only placed that world inside the barracks. Here, the grand machinery of empire reveals its hidden dependency. Company power was never simply British will imposed upon Indian soil. It moved through Indian clerks who kept revenue accounts, Indian bankers who financed campaigns, Indian merchants who supplied armies, Indian princes who signed treaties under pressure, Indian informants who mapped rival courts, Indian munshis and translators who made governance intelligible, and Indian soldiers who converted orders into force. The political resident at an Indian court was not merely an observer. He was a listening post, a negotiator, an intelligence collector, and often the quiet architect of dependency. Around him gathered secretaries, interpreters, brokers, spies, creditors, and local elites who understood factional rivalries, succession disputes, wounded pride, unpaid debts, and dangerous ambitions. The company conquered not only with cannon, conquered with information. It ruled by learning who feared whom, who needed money, who wanted restoration, who could be isolated, and who could be destroyed by delay. This is why the company empire cannot be understood through the crude vocabulary of foreign versus native alone. It was a layered structure of collaboration and coercion, ambition and fear, survival and opportunism. Some Indian rulers resisted until their states were broken. Others allied because every available option carried risk. Some sepoys served with discipline for decades. Others would later revolt when the moral terms of service seemed violated. Some financiers backed the company because it promised stability, only to discover that stability could become subordination. The strategic genius and the moral darkness of company rule lay in its ability to convert Indian resources into imperial power while presenting that power as proof of external superiority. Indian revenue paid Indian soldiers under European officers. Those soldiers enforced treaties on Indian states. Those treaties produced more revenue. Revenue became army, army became pressure, pressure became dominion. The loop was elegant. It was also unstable. For beneath the language of discipline and alliance lay a permanent human truth. Obedience can be organized, but trust cannot be manufactured indefinitely. When pay, honor, religion, status, and political legitimacy remain aligned, an army may hold an empire together. When those bonds begin to fray, the army ceases to be merely a pillar. It becomes a fault line. And by the middle of the 19th century AD, annexation, reform, racial arrogance, and religious suspicion were pressing harder and harder against that fault line. By the mid-19th century AD, the company's empire appeared disciplined, mapped, audited, and secure. Yet beneath that surface lay a dangerous contradiction. The institution depended on Indian soldiers, Indian allies, Indian landholders, Indian clerks, and Indian legitimacy, while increasingly behaving as if none of those relationships required consent. The company had changed character. The cautious merchant state that once negotiated for privileges had become an engine of territorial consolidation. Under Lord Dalhousie, expansion acquired the clean, bloodless vocabulary of law. The doctrine of lapse declared that when an Indian ruler died without a natural male heir recognized by the company, the state could be annexed. To officials in Calcutta, this looked like administrative logic. To many Indian courts, it looked like dynastic death by paperwork. Satara was annexed in 1848 AD. Jhansi's succession crisis followed in 1853 AD. Nagpur was absorbed in 1854 AD. Each case sent a message far beyond the annexed territory. Sovereignty no longer rested securely on treaty, lineage, sacred adoption, or local recognition. It rested on company approval. A throne could survive armies, rivals, and intrigue, yet still be erased by a foreign legal opinion. This was not merely land hunger. It was the managed demolition of political futures. Then came Awadh in 1856 AD. Officially, annexation was justified on grounds of misgovernment. Strategically, Awadh was wealthy, fertile, and deeply tied to the Bengal army's recruiting world. Its court, landlords, pensioners, retainers, and military families formed one of the social foundations of company power. The shock was therefore profound. Loyal service had not protected Awadh. Long alliance had not protected Awadh. The lesson traveled quickly. Obedience was no guarantee of survival. Inside the army, older grievances now gained sharper meaning. Sepoys had concerns over pay, allowances, promotion, status, and the increasingly racialized discipline of British officers. There were fears over overseas service, which threatened caste and religious standing for many. Missionary activity, legal reform, and the confident arrogance of some officials deepened the suspicion that company rule aimed not only at revenue and territory, but at belief itself. In that atmosphere, the Enfield rifle cartridge controversy became explosive. The new cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities. The historical power of the rumor lay not in every technical detail, but in the collapse of trust that made it believable. The cartridge became a symbol of the entire imperial relationship. To bite it was to submit. To refuse it was to defy the military order on which the company rested. This is how great ruptures often begin. Not with a single cause, but with a symbol that suddenly gathers every cause into one act. At Meerut in May 1857 AD, the fuse reached flame. Sepoys rose, violence erupted, and the rebels marched toward Delhi. There, the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II became a reluctant but potent emblem. Delhi was not merely a military objective. It was memory turned into strategy, the ghost of sovereignty raised against a corporate empire. The uprising spread to Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and other centers. But it was never one simple thing. For some, it was restoration. For others, revenge. For dispossessed rulers, a chance to recover authority. For landholders and peasants, a reckoning with revenue pressure and local power. For sepoys, a defense of honor, religion, pay, and rank. For Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, personal dispossession and political resistance fused into enduring legend. Nor can the violence be purified by distance. Atrocities occurred in rebel-held areas, including the killing of Europeans and Indian Christians. British reprisals were severe, public, and often designed to terrorize as much as punish. Villages were targeted. Suspects were executed. Afterward, racial attitudes hardened into a more rigid and contemptuous imperial ideology. The revolt was not simply a barracks mutiny, and it was not yet a unified modern national war. It was a vast, uneven, many-centered uprising against company rule, born from annexation, anxiety, military grievance, religious fear, and political dispossession. When the smoke began to clear, one fact stood above all others. The company had survived battles before, but it had lost the argument of legitimacy. The revolt did not restore the old order. It shattered the fiction that a corporation could continue ruling a subcontinent in its own name. The answer would come in the Government of India Act of 1858 AD, when Parliament took direct control of the empire the company had built. By 1858 AD, the East India Company had lost the one asset no empire can survive without: the appearance of legitimacy. Its armies had fought back. Its officers had retaken cities. Its authority, in the narrow military sense, had been restored. But politically, the foundation had cracked. A corporation that had once sold itself to Britain as an instrument of order, revenue, and strategic advantage now stood before Parliament as the author of a catastrophe. The British state responded not by dismantling the empire, but by changing its owner. The Government of India Act of 1858 AD ended company rule and transferred authority over India to the British Crown. The old machinery of directors, shareholders, and commercial sovereignty was pushed aside. In its place came a Secretary of State for India, advised by a council in London, and a viceroy in India who governed in the name of the monarch. The language changed, the symbolism changed, the theory of responsibility changed, but the imperial structure itself did not dissolve. This is the great institutional irony at the heart of the transfer. The company was condemned for misrule, yet the empire it had assembled was too valuable, too vast, and too strategically embedded to abandon. Britain did not reject the conquest. It nationalized it. The crown inherited armies that had been built by the company and then reorganized after revolt. It inherited revenue systems rooted in decades of extraction, negotiation, experiment, settlement, and coercion. It inherited bureaucracies shaped by company habits, political residents trained in surveillance and influence, legal assumptions hardened by conquest, and treaties with princes whose sovereignty had already been narrowed by alliance, debt, and pressure. The British Raj did not begin on empty ground. It began atop a corporate foundation. Queen Victoria's proclamation of 1858 AD was crafted as both reassurance and strategy. It promised non-interference in religious belief and practice, answering one of the deepest anxieties that had fed the revolt. It offered protection to Indian princes and pledged respect for existing treaties, signaling that the British state had absorbed a bitter lesson from annexationist arrogance. The doctrine of lapse had taught rulers that no throne was fully safe from legal interpretation. After 1857 AD, the crown preferred loyal princes to desperate ones. This was not simple benevolence. It was imperial adaptation. Power had studied its own near-death experience and adjusted its methods. Where the company had often expanded through destabilization, the crown increasingly sought rule through managed hierarchy. Princes preserved under supervision, elites courted, armies restructured, religious assurances proclaimed, and rebellion remembered as a warning written into policy. The company itself lingered only as a ghost of its former being. Stripped of rule, deprived of its imperial function, it survived briefly as a legal shell before dissolution in 1874 AD. The institution that had once collected taxes, fielded armies, manipulated courts, shaped successions, and negotiated like a sovereign passed into the archive. But its death certificate did not mark the death of the system it had created. For this was the final transformation of corporate conquest. The ledger handed its empire to the flag. A private institution had opened the gates, built the machinery, normalized dominion, and converted commerce into sovereignty. Then, when the costs became too visible and the risks too dangerous, the state stepped in to claim both responsibility and reward. The company died as ruler. Its creation lived on under a new name. The empire was not abolished. It was transferred. The company passed out of government but not out of history. Its name could be dissolved. Its directors could be stripped of sovereignty. Its armies could be reassigned, its ledgers placed under a different seal. Yet the deeper invention survived. The discovery that commerce, when armed, chartered, and shielded by ambiguity, could acquire the habits of empire before the language of empire had fully admitted what was happening. The verdict is severe, because the ascent of the English East India Company was never a simple tale of destiny, racial inevitability, or battlefield genius. It began with a charter in 1600 AD, a document that seemed administrative, commercial, and almost technical. But inside that paper lived monopoly, maritime strategy, national rivalry, and the first outline of a political creature that was neither fully merchant nor fully state. Then came Plassey in 1757 AD, where battle became inseparable from conspiracy. War, bribery, intelligence, banking interests, court rivalries, and calculated betrayal fused into an event closer to a hostile takeover than a conventional military triumph. Then came Buxar in 1764 AD, where the company proved that it could defeat not merely a divided court, but a major Indian coalition. And in 1765 AD, with the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, victory became taxation. That was the hinge. Not merely the musket, not merely the treaty, the revenue stream. From that moment, the company possessed the fatal loop of imperial power. Taxes funded armies. Armies protected taxes. Protected taxes financed expansion. Expansion demanded more administration, more coercion, and more justification. The machine rolled outward through alliances, wars, debts, residents, annexations, informants, and carefully drafted dependencies, until the rupture of 1857 AD exposed the accumulated pressure beneath the surface of corporate rule. The Government of India Act of 1858 AD did not erase what had been built, transferred it. The crown inherited an empire whose foundations had been laid by merchants, soldiers, clerks, bankers, princes, intermediaries, sepoys, shareholders, and ministers who often benefited from a system they could also publicly condemn. The true cost was not only territorial conquest, it was moral distance. Decisions made through ledgers and committee minutes became hunger in villages, anxiety in courts, discipline in barracks, and policy across continents. Responsibility was dispersed so efficiently that no single hand seemed to hold the whole instrument. Yet the instruments still cut. And here lies the modern mirror. The East India Company is not a dead curiosity from the age of sail. It is a warning about what happens when profit gains access to coercion, when governments outsource power and then become dependent on the results, when accountability arrives only after the structure has become too useful to dismantle. States may denounce private ambition in speeches while relying on it in policy. Corporations may speak the language of service while accumulating the functions of sovereignty. Human beings, across centuries, remain astonishingly skilled at hiding appetite inside procedure. The company teaches that institutions do not need crowns, sacred genealogies, or ancient banners to become imperial. They need privilege, capital, armed force, legal ambiguity, weak accountability, and time. Above all, they need a gap between those who benefit and those who bear the consequence. So the legacy question remains. When power is divided among investors, officials, soldiers, and distant administrators, where does moral responsibility finally reside? And what kind of civilization is created when no one is willing to answer? The most dangerous empires may begin as paperwork. If this forensic journey through power, strategy, and human nature has been valuable, subscribe to Archives of Humanity for more deep historical investigations built around causes, consequences, and the machinery beneath events. To continue the session, select the video now appearing on the end screen. And in the comments, answer this directly. Was the East India Company more a corporation, more a state, or something more dangerous than either?